The photo showed up on my phone at 6:52 on a Friday night. My son Gregory, cutting a red ribbon in front of a restaurant I had paid for, surrounded by 40 people I didn't know, and a headline underneath it that read Ember Oak Grand Opening, a dream realized. I sat in my recliner with the phone shaking slightly in my hand, looking for my own face somewhere in that crowd of smiling strangers. It wasn't there. I hadn't been invited. I hadn't even been told. $80,000 of my retirement, wired out of an account my late wife and I had built for 34 years, and my own son couldn't be bothered to send me an address and a time. I set the phone down on the side table very carefully, the way you set down something that might shatter, and I said out loud to an empty living room, "Something is wrong here." I had no idea yet just how wrong. I'm glad you're here with me tonight. If you're new to these stories, welcome, and if you've been with me before, thank you for coming back. Drop the name of your city or your country in the comments below. I read every single one, and it means more to me than you know to picture where all of you are sitting while you listen. A quick note before we go further. This story blends real patterns of family financial abuse with details that have been adapted for the sake of the telling. Names, places, and certain events are fictionalized. But the lesson underneath all of it is not fiction at all, and I'd ask you to sit with that as we go. My name is Walter Hutchins. I am 68 years old, and for 31 years I worked as a supervisor at the Regional Postal Distribution Center outside Springfield, the kind of job where you learn to read people by the way they hand you a package, whether they're in a hurry, whether they're lying about what's inside, whether they're grieving or celebrating or just tired. I retired 4 years ago with a pension, a paid-off house on Larkspur Lane, and a wife named Loretta who had promised me we would finally take that Alaska cruise we'd been talking about since 1994. We never got to go. Loretta passed 18 months after I retired, and if you want the exact number, it was 2 years, 1 month, and 6 days before the night that photograph landed on my phone. I wasn't counting. I just knew. Gregory is our only child. 39 years old, built like his mother, stubborn like me, and possessed, for as long as I can remember, of one singular dream: he wanted to own a restaurant. Not work in one. Own one. He'd worked his way up through kitchen since he was 17, dishwasher to line cook to sous chef to, eventually, a head chef position at a decent place downtown that he never felt was really his. Every family dinner for a decade had some version of the same conversation. Dad, if I just had the capital. Dad, I know exactly how I'd run it different. Dad, Vanessa and I have been looking at a space on Whitmore Street. Vanessa is his wife of 6 years, quiet around me in a way I'd always chalked up to shyness, though I've had a lot of time since that Friday night to reconsider what quiet can actually mean. In March of last year, Gregory sat across from me at my own kitchen table, the same table where Loretta used to grade his spelling tests, and he laid out a business plan. Spreadsheets, projected revenue, a lease agreement for a space on Whitmore Street that used to be an old hardware store. He had a partner lined up, a man named Dominic Reyes, who Gregory said had run 3 successful restaurants in Charlotte before relocating to Springfield to be closer to his aging mother. Dominic would handle the financing structure and the business side. Gregory would run the kitchen and the concept. All they needed, Gregory said, was an initial investment to get the doors open, and he was asking me for $80,000. I want to be honest with you about what went through my mind in that moment, because I think a lot of you have sat across a table from someone you love and felt exactly this. Part of me thought, that is a great deal of money, and I should ask harder questions. And a bigger part of me thought about Loretta, about how she used to say that our whole purpose in that house was to hand our son a life better than the one we'd had. I thought about how quiet the house had become since she died, how the only voice that still filled it some evenings was Gregory's, on the phone, telling me about his day. I wanted, more than I wanted to admit even to myself, to be needed by my son again. Dominic Reyes came to dinner 2 weeks later. Silver-templed, expensive watch, the kind of handshake that lasts half a second too long, like his making sure you remember it. He told me, over pot roast, that Gregory had more raw talent than any young chef he'd worked with in 15 years, and that with the right capital behind him, Ember and Oak was going to be the best thing to happen to downtown Springfield in a generation. I remember feeling, for reasons I couldn't explain and didn't examine, a small cold place in my stomach that I told myself was nerves. I wired the money on April the 9th. Over the following months, Gregory visited less than he had before, which he explained by pointing at the construction timeline, the permitting delays, the 70-hour weeks it took to build a restaurant from an old hardware store. I told myself that was normal. I told myself a man building his dream doesn't have time for Sunday dinners with his widowed father. I kept the porch light on anyway, most nights, out of habit more than expectation. And then came that Friday night in October, the ribbon, the 40 strangers, the headline that used the word dream without once mentioning where the money for that dream had come from. I didn't call him that night. I sat with it. I want you to understand that about me, because it matters for everything that follows. I have spent a career learning that the worst thing you can do when something feels wrong is react before you understand the shape of it. So I sat in my recliner until nearly midnight, scrolling through the restaurant social media page, looking at photo after photo of my son's grand night, looking for some innocent explanation for why his own father had not received so much as a text message. I found the explanation the next morning, and it was not innocent at all. Saturday, 8:15 in the morning, my neighbor Ruth Callahan knocked on my door holding a folded newspaper insert with the restaurant's ad in it. Ruth is 71, has lived 3 houses down since before Gregory was born, and has the particular directness of a woman who buried 2 husbands and has decided she no longer has patience for softening bad news. "Walter," she said, not even waiting for me to say good morning, "I was at that opening last night. I saw the ad in the paper, I thought your family would want the support, so I went. I looked for you the whole evening." She paused, and I could see her deciding whether to keep going. "Walter, I asked Vanessa where you were. She told me you weren't feeling up to it. Then not 20 minutes later I heard her tell someone else that you two hadn't spoken in months." I stood in my own doorway feeling the ground shift slightly under a stillness that had nothing to do with my balance and everything to do with what I'd just been told. "Ruth," I said, "I saw Gregory 2 weeks ago. We talked on the phone Tuesday." She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they already suspect the thing you're about to discover is worse than you think. "Then somebody's telling 2 different stories," she said, "and I don't think it's you. I want to pause here and tell you something I've learned about the moment suspicion turns into certainty. It rarely announces itself with a single dramatic revelation. It arrives in small mismatched pieces. The way Ruth's sentence didn't fit the sentence Gregory had told me on the phone, the way a coat doesn't fit right on a body it wasn't tailored for. I made coffee I didn't drink and I sat at that same kitchen table, and I did something I am not proud of, though I don't regret it either. I opened my laptop, and I logged into the joint checking account Loretta and I had kept for decades, the one Gregory had access to as a backup signer since his mother's illness, the one I'd stopped checking closely because I trusted my own son with the details of my life the way you trust a hand you've held for 40 years. There were withdrawals I didn't recognize. Not the $80,000 from April, I knew about that one, I'd authorized it myself. These were smaller, recurring, dated across the summer. $600 here. $1,200 there. A withdrawal of $4,000 in August labeled, in the bank's cryptic shorthand, as a transfer to an account ending in the digits 4471. I did not recognize that account number. I had never authorized a transfer to it. I sat looking at that string of digits for a long time, the way you look at a word in a language you almost speak, close enough to read but not quite close enough to understand. I called the bank's fraud line at 9 a.m. sharp. The representative, a patient young woman named Priya, walked me through the transaction history and confirmed what I was starting to suspect in my bones. The transfers had been authorized using online banking credentials tied to my account, credentials I had shared with Gregory 2 years ago when Loretta was in the hospital and I needed him to be able to pay bills on my behalf if I couldn't get to a computer. I had never revoked that access. I had never even thought to. Mr. Hutchins, Priya said gently, I can flag the account for review, but I want to be honest with you. Based on what I'm seeing, someone with legitimate login credentials has been moving money out of this account regularly for about 4 months. Legitimate credentials? My son's credentials. My stomach went cold in a way that had nothing left in it pretending to be nerves. If you're still with me, I want you to comment the word listening below, just so I know you're here, because what I found over the next several days is going to be harder to hear than what I've told you so far. And I want to say, gently, that some details ahead have been shaped for the sake of narrative, though the underlying pattern is one that plays out in real families more often than any of us would like to believe. That Saturday afternoon, I did something Gregory did not know I could do. I still had a key to the small apartment he and Vanessa had kept above their old rental before the restaurant opened, a key he'd given me years ago in case of emergencies, one he had clearly forgotten I still carried. I am not proud of what I did next, but I have stopped apologizing for it, because I believe now that a man has a right to understand what has been done to him before he confronts the person who did it. I let myself into that apartment on Sunday morning while I knew, from Gregory's own social media, that both he and Vanessa would be at the restaurant handling their first weekend brunch service. I did not take anything. I did not disturb anything I didn't have to. But on the small desk in what used to be their spare room, I found a banker's box of paperwork that Gregory, in the chaos of moving into the restaurant full-time, had not yet relocated. Inside that box was a folder labeled, in Gregory's own handwriting, Dad, Estate Planning. My hands were not steady when I opened it. Inside was a durable power of attorney document, the kind Margaret Doyle would later explain to me in careful, unhurried detail, granting Gregory authority over my financial accounts, my property, and my medical decisions. My name was typed neatly on the principal line. There was a signature on the line beneath it that was meant to be mine. I have signed my name more than 68,000 times in my life, if you want to do the math on that, and I promise you I know what my own signature looks like. This was close. It was close enough to fool a bank teller glancing at it for 3 seconds. It was not close enough to fool me. Beneath that document was a second one, a listing agreement for my house on Larkspur Lane, dated 6 weeks earlier, naming a realty group I had never heard of and never contacted, authorizing them to list my home for sale at a price of $310,000. My signature was on that one too. I had never signed it. I sat down on the edge of that spare room bed that used to be, I remember distantly, the room where Loretta kept her sewing machine, and I felt something in my chest go very quiet and very cold, the particular quiet of a man realizing the floor he's been standing on was never solid to begin with. I found a third document that Sunday morning, and this is the one that made me understand I was not looking at a single act of desperation. I was looking at a plan. It was a printed email, dated the week before the restaurant's grand opening, from Dominic Reyes to Gregory. I have read it enough times now that I can recite portions of it without looking. It discussed, in the flat, business-like language men like Dominic used to make theft sound like strategy, the timeline for what it called finalizing the Hutchins asset transition. It referenced the house sale. It referenced something called the secondary fund, which I did not yet understand but would come to understand very well in the weeks ahead. And it ended with a line I have not been able to forget since the moment I read it. Your father doesn't need to know the details. He just needs to sign where we tell him to sign, and by spring this will all be behind us. I put every page back exactly where I found it. I locked the apartment door behind me, and I drove home to Larkspur Lane with both hands steady on the wheel and a fury inside me that I had not felt since the worst days of watching Loretta's illness take pieces of her I couldn't get back. I understood, driving home that Sunday, that my son had not simply forgotten to invite me to his grand opening. My son and a man I had welcomed to my table had been quietly, methodically working to take my house, my accounts, and my independence, and the restaurant I had funded was, I was starting to suspect, only one piece of something much larger. Monday morning, I did not call the police. I want to explain why, because I think it's a decision some of you would make differently, and I respect that. I had one signature that was not mine and one restaurant that had no records I could yet examine. I had suspicion, and suspicion, in my experience watching packages move through a distribution center for 3 decades, is not the same thing as proof, and proof is the only thing that protects you when the person you're accusing knows exactly how to look innocent. What I needed first was somebody who understood computers better than I did, and I knew exactly who to call. Samuel Okafor runs a repair shop on Delancey Avenue called Sam's Device Clinic, and I had known him for 6 years since he fixed the printer at my old office more times than either of us could count. Sam is 34, patient, and has the specific talent of explaining technical things to people my age without once making us feel foolish for not already knowing them. I brought him my laptop and, more importantly, an old tablet of Gregory's that he had left at my house 8 months earlier and never asked for back, one I suspected still held cached logins to accounts I needed to understand. Sam sat with both devices for the better part of 2 hours while I waited in his small lobby drinking coffee from a machine that had clearly seen better decades. When he came out, his expression had shifted from professional curiosity into something more careful. "Mr. Hutchins," he said, "I want to show you something, and I want you to know I'm not enjoying showing it to you." He pulled up, on the tablet, an email account I did not recognize as Gregory's primary address, one registered under a slight variation of his name, greghutchins.finance, that Gregory had apparently used to correspond with Dominic Reyes and with someone else entirely, a woman named Priscilla Ames, listed in the emails as a financial consultant. The thread went back nearly a year, well before Gregory had ever sat me down at my kitchen table with his spreadsheets. Priscilla Ames, it turned out, specialized in something the emails referred to as legacy fund structuring, a phrase that meant nothing to me until Sam explained, in his patient way, that it appeared to describe convincing adult children to gain financial control over aging parents under the cover of legitimate business ventures, then using that control to liquidate the parents' assets into investment vehicles the children and their partners controlled. "Restaurant not required," Sam said quietly, "but a restaurant works well because it looks like a real business with real receipts and real reasons for cash to move around." I sat in that small lobby and read 40 pages of printed emails that Sam handed me without a word. I read Gregory describing me, in one message dated the previous January, as, quote, "easy, he trusts me completely, he's been lonely since Mom died, this should move faster than the Sims situation." I stopped on that line for a long time. The Sims situation. I did not know who Sims was yet. I would, within the week, and it would break something in me that I am still, months later, working to put back together. I want to pause the story here and thank you again for staying with me. I know this is a lot to carry, and if you need to step away and come back, I understand completely. If you're still here, type the word "still" in the comments so I know you're with me, because the next part of what I found is the part that turned this from a story about betrayal into a story about a great many people who never should have trusted the people they trusted. A brief note. Some of the technical and dialogue details ahead have been dramatized for clarity, though the pattern of financial elder exploitation they represent is very real and documented by law enforcement across the country. That same week, I went to see an attorney. Margaret Doyle had drawn up Loretta's and my modest estate documents 11 years earlier, and I still had her card in the drawer where I kept things I hoped I would never need again. Margaret is 62, silver-haired, direct in the way of someone who has spent 3 decades watching people discover the worst about the people they love, and she did not flinch once while I laid the forged power of attorney and the forged listing agreement on her desk. "Walter," she said, when I'd finished, "I need you to understand 2 things right now, before we go any further. First, what you've shown me is forgery, and forgery involving real property in this state is a felony, not a misdemeanor, not a family dispute, a felony. Second, and more urgently, that fraudulent power of attorney, even though it was never lawfully executed, may already have been presented to institutions who believed it was valid. We need to lock down every account and every property record you have today, this afternoon, before anyone can act on paperwork that says your son has authority he was never actually given." We spent that afternoon filing an emergency revocation with my bank, my mortgage holder, and the county recorder's office, formally putting on record that any power of attorney purporting to grant Gregory Hutchins authority over my affairs was fraudulent and void. Margaret also filed what she called a lease pendens against the fraudulent listing agreement, a notice that froze any sale of my home until the matter was resolved by a court. "This buys us time," she told me, "but Walter, time is the only thing it buys us. If Gregory and this Reyes character sense that you know, they may accelerate whatever else they're planning. We need to understand the full scope before we act, not after." Margaret recommended a private investigator she had worked with on similar matters before, a retired sheriff's detective named Frank Delgado who had spent the back half of his career investigating exactly this kind of crime, elder financial exploitation dressed up as family business. Frank was built like a man who had spent 30 years on his feet, grey crew cut, a manner that was gentle with me and, I would learn, considerably less gentle when he was tracking down the people who had done this. I met him 2 days later in Margaret's conference room, and I told him everything, the forged documents, the emails, the reference to something called the Sims situation. Frank wrote for a long time without interrupting me, and when I finished, he set his pen down and looked at me steadily. "Mr. Hutchins," he said, "I'm going to be honest with you about what I think we're dealing with, and I want you to sit with it before you decide how you feel. Dominic Reyes is not a restaurant investor who happened to also dabble in financial consulting. From what you've described, and from a name I recognize, I believe he runs a coordinated operation that specifically targets widowed or divorced parents through their adult children, using a legitimate-looking business as cover for asset extraction. Your son may have started this as a desperate man trying to fund a dream. But somewhere along the way, he became a tool for something considerably larger and considerably more organized than a restaurant loan. Over the following 10 days, Frank worked the case the way I imagine he worked cases for 30 years, patiently, methodically, without ever tipping his hand. He confirmed that Dominic Reyes had, under a slightly different name, been investigated 3 years earlier in North Carolina in connection with an elderly widower named Harold Sims, who had lost nearly $200,000 in a scheme almost identical to mine, dressed up that time as a boutique hotel investment. Charges had never been filed because Harold Sims had died of a heart attack for months into the investigation, and his family, grieving and exhausted, had declined to pursue it further. I sat with that fact for a long time. A man had died in the middle of exactly what was happening to me, and the person responsible had simply packed up and moved to Springfield to do it again. Frank also confirmed something I had begun to suspect but had not let myself fully believe. Priscilla Ames was not a licensed financial consultant of any kind. She held no certification, no registered business, nothing beyond a website with stock photography and testimonials. Frank determined, through simple reverse image searches, had been lifted from an entirely unrelated consulting firm in another state. Her actual role, as best Frank could determine, was to draft the documents, the trust structures, the transfer paperwork, that gave Dominic and whichever adult child he was working with the appearance of legal authority over the parents' assets. She was, in Frank's words, the paperwork half of the operation, while Dominic handled what Frank called the relationship half, the charm, the dinners, the reassurance. The hardest evidence Frank gathered came from something I asked him to do, and I want to be honest that I hesitated before asking. I asked him to find out whether Gregory had known, from the very beginning, what he was actually agreeing to, or whether my son had been drawn in slowly the way I understood Vanessa's own father, Frank discovered through public records, had been drawn into something similar years earlier as a young man, before becoming, apparently, one of Dominic's most trusted associates. I needed to know whether I was fighting a stranger who had used my son, or whether I was fighting my son. Frank was gentle with me when he told me the answer was probably both, in different measures, and that the only way to know for certain was to hear it directly from Gregory himself, in a setting where he did not know he was being recorded. That is when Margaret, Frank, and I began to plan what came next, and I want to tell you plainly that this was the hardest decision of the entire ordeal, harder even than reading those emails for the first time. I had to decide whether I was willing to sit across a table from my own son, knowing what I now knew, and let him believe I still trusted him, long enough to get him to say the truth out loud where it could be recorded and used to protect not just myself, but whoever else Dominic Reyes and Priscilla Ames were already working on next. If you're still with me, comment the word truth below, because I promise you this story is not close to finished. And I want to remind you gently, as I have before, that certain scenes and conversations ahead have been reconstructed and dramatized for the purpose of this telling, though the mechanics of the fraud described are drawn from real and well-documented patterns of elder financial abuse. Frank arranged for a small recording device, no larger than a shirt button, and walked me through exactly how to wear it and how to behave so that nothing about my manner would tip off a man who, I reminded myself constantly, had spent his entire adult life reading Kitchens Under Pressure and reading people along with them. I called Gregory on a Wednesday and told him I'd been hurt that I missed the opening, that I understood how busy he must have been, and that I'd love to come by the restaurant on a quiet weekday afternoon, just the two of us, to see what he'd built. He sounded relieved when he agreed, the particular relief of a man who believes he has successfully avoided a difficult conversation. I walked into Ember and Oak on a Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon, between the lunch and dinner services, and I will tell you honestly that it was beautiful. Exposed brick, warm lighting, the old hardware store's original tin ceiling restored and gleaming. My son had built something with real talent, and for one unguarded moment, sitting at the bar while he poured me a coffee, I let myself feel proud of him the way I had every right to feel before I knew what I knew. Then Dominic Reyes walked in through the kitchen doors, unannounced, and the pride curdled into something colder and more useful. "Harold," Dominic said, and caught himself immediately, forcing a laugh. "Sorry, Walter, force of habit, long day." I did not react outwardly. I have spent 31 years learning not to react outwardly. But inside, everything went very still, because Harold Sims had been dead for 3 years, and the man standing in front of me had just called me by a dead man's name out of nothing more than habit, the habit of a man who has done this so many times the names blur together. I let the conversation move naturally for 20 minutes, coffee, small talk about the restaurant's early reviews, before I said, carefully, the line Margaret and Frank had helped me rehearse. "Gregory, I've been thinking. Maybe it's time I signed those additional papers you mentioned last spring. About the house. I know I've been slow about it, and I don't want to hold things up for you and Dominic." I watched my son's face, and I watched something behind his eyes calculate, the particular expression of a man deciding how much he can safely say. "Dad," Gregory said, glancing once, briefly, at Dominic, "that would really help. Things have been tight since we opened, tighter than we told you, honestly, and if the house sale goes through before the end of the quarter, it takes so much pressure off." Dominic leaned forward, all warmth, all reassurance, and said the words I will remember for the rest of my life. "Walter, your son has done everything right here. All the trust fund needs now is your signature transferring the deed, and by spring, this will all be behind everyone. You'll have done more for this family than most fathers ever get the chance to. By spring, this will all be behind us." The exact words from the email I had read in Sam's shop weeks earlier, spoken now out loud, in my son's own restaurant, by the man who had once called an elderly widower named Harold Sims until the pressure of it, I have to believe, at least contributed to his death. I asked, as calmly as I could manage, "What exactly is the trust fund for, Dominic?" I don't think Gregory's ever fully explained it. And Dominic, comfortable, confident, certain he was speaking to a confused old man who trusted his son completely, explained it in full. The Whitmore Legacy Trust, structured to hold my house proceeds, my retirement accounts, and, eventually, my life insurance, all technically controlled by Gregory as trustee, with Dominic serving as financial advisor to the trust, a role that came, he mentioned almost as an afterthought, with a standard management fee of 8% annually. 8% of everything I had built across a lifetime, flowing quietly into an account controlled by a man who had used another old man's dead body as a stepping stone to my kitchen table. I finished my coffee. I thanked them both. I told Gregory the first needed a few days to think it over properly, and I left Ember and Oak with a recording in my shirt pocket that Margaret would later describe as one of the cleanest pieces of intent evidence she had seen in 20 years of practice. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for a long time before I could make myself drive home. That evening, Frank called with news that changed the shape of everything again. Through a source at the county clerk's office, he had learned that a similar Whitmore-named trust structure, under a slightly different name, had been recorded 18 months earlier in a neighboring county, tied to an elderly woman named Constance Faraday, a widow whose family had reported her missing from regular contact with old friends shortly after her own son had introduced her to Dominic Reyes at what was, at the time, a different restaurant entirely, one that had quietly closed 11 months after opening. Its owner, records showed, having declared personal bankruptcy the same month Constance Faraday's house sold for well below market value to a holding company Frank was still tracing. I want you to sit with that for a moment the way I had to. This was not one desperate son trying to fund a dream who got in over his head. This was a machine, built to be run again and again, restaurant after restaurant, family after family, each one a fresh coat of paint over the same theft. I called Detective Renata Cruz the next morning, a name Frank had given me at the county sheriff's office who specialized in financial crimes against seniors, and I laid out everything I had, the forged documents, the recording, Harold Sims, Constance Faraday, and a growing certainty that there were more names we hadn't found yet. Detective Cruz listened without interrupting for the better part of an hour, the particular quality of listening I recognized from my own years reading people at that distribution center, patient, absorbing, filing everything away before reacting. When I finished, she set down her pen and said, "Mr. Hutchins, what you've described, on its own, is enough for a fraud investigation. What you described alongside a documented prior victim and a suspicious death is enough for us to bring in state financial crimes and likely the FBI's Elder Fraud Task Force, because if this man has run this scheme in 2 counties already, there is a very good chance he's running it somewhere else right now, on somebody else's father, while we're sitting in this room." Within a week, Special Agent Miriam Holbrook from the regional FBI field office had joined the investigation, and I sat in a room very much like the one where Nathan Cross once sat in a story I heard long after my own ordeal, being asked the same careful, thorough questions, being told the same sobering truth, that my case had become the thread that could unravel something far larger than my own house and my own retirement. Agent Holbrook explained that they had, in fact, been quietly investigating Dominic Reyes for the better part of a year under a different alias, and that my evidence, my recording, my forged documents, my willingness to keep pretending I trusted my son for 2 more weeks, could be the piece that finally let them move. Those 2 weeks were the hardest of my life since Loretta died. I sat across from my son at that restaurant twice more, playing a role I hated playing, listening to him describe timelines for signing documents that would have handed over everything I had left. I want to tell you honestly that there were moments, sitting across from him, watching him laugh at something one of his line cooks said, that I could still see the little boy who used to fall asleep against my shoulder during Sunday drives, and I grieved that boy the entire time I was gathering evidence against the man he had become. Grief and duty do not cancel each other out. I have learned that they can sit in the same chest at the same time. On a Thursday evening in early December, at Agent Holbrook's direction, I invited Gregory, Vanessa, and Dominic to my house on Larkspur Lane for what I described as a final signing dinner, the papers ready, the trust finalized, everything, I told them, exactly the way they wanted it. I did not know, walking into my own kitchen that night, that federal agents were positioned 2 houses down, that Frank Delgado was parked across the street in an unmarked car. The detective crews had arrest warrants already signed and waiting in a folder on the passenger seat beside her. They arrived at 7. Dominic brought wine, the same easy confidence he'd worn every time I'd seen him, a man who had clearly done this enough times to believe nothing could touch him. Vanessa was quiet, the way she always was, though I noticed, for the first time, that her hand stayed folded tightly in her lap the entire meal, and I wondered, not for the first time, how much of this she had known and how much she had simply been too afraid to ask. We ate. We made small talk about the restaurant's holiday menu. And then, at the moment Margaret and Frank and I had planned for weeks, I set the folder of documents on the table, and instead of the trust paperwork Dominic expected to find inside, I laid out copies of everything. The forged power of attorney. The forged listing agreement. The email describing the Sims situation. A printed photograph of Constance Faraday, whose family detective crews had by then located and interviewed. I know what the Whitmore Legacy Trust actually is, I said, and I watched 3 faces change in 3 different ways. Gregory's went white. Vanessa's crumpled into something that looked, for the first time in years, like genuine fear rather than practiced quiet. Dominic's, for just a moment, went cold and calculating before smoothing back into a professional, patronizing calm. Walter, he began, I think there's been some confusion. There's no confusion, I said. There's a dead man named Harold Sims and a missing woman named Constance Faraday, and I think you're going to want a lawyer before you say another word. Dominic stood so fast his chair scraped hard against my kitchen floor, and that was the moment the front door opened and Agent Holbrook stepped through it, followed by 2 uniformed officers, followed by Detective Cruz, her badge already raised. Gregory did not run. I want you to know that, because it is the one small mercy in that entire evening. He sat frozen at my kitchen table, the same table where his mother used to grade his spelling tests, and when the officer read him his rights, he looked at me with an expression I will carry for the rest of my life, somewhere between a child caught in a lie and a man who had known, on some buried level, exactly what he had been part of and had chosen, every single day, not to look at it directly. The trial took 9 months to reach a verdict. I will spare you every hearing and every filing, but I will tell you what mattered. Detective Cruz's investigation eventually connected Dominic Reyes and Priscilla Ames to 4 confirmed victims across 3 states, totaling losses of over $1.1 million, and to Harold Sims's death, which a forensic review reopened at the FBI's request determined had been substantially hastened by the acute stress of discovering, in his final months, that his life savings were gone. Priscilla Ames took a plea deal in exchange for testimony, and her cooperation confirmed everything Frank had suspected about the pattern, the deliberate targeting of widowed or divorced parents through adult children who were themselves financially desperate enough to be recruited. Dominic Reyes was convicted of conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and, in connection with the Sims case, criminally negligent homicide, and sentenced to 22 years. Priscilla Ames received 7 years under her cooperation agreement. Vanessa, it turned out, had known considerably less than I feared and considerably more than she ever admitted comfortably, and she testified against both Dominic and, in the end, against her own husband, in exchange for probation and a chance, the prosecutor told me privately, to actually start over. Gregory was convicted of forgery and conspiracy to commit fraud. He did not fight the charges. His attorney argued, and the judge seemed to weigh seriously, that he had been drawn into Dominic's operation slowly, through genuine financial desperation and genuine ambition twisted by a predator who specialized in exactly that kind of twisting. He was sentenced to 6 years, with the possibility of parole after 3. I sat in that courtroom every single day of both trials, and on the day Gregory was sentenced, he turned to look at me before the officers led him out, and he mouthed 2 words I have chosen, for my own peace, to believe he meant honestly. "I'm sorry." I do not know, even now, whether I believe he understood the full weight of what those words needed to carry. I know that I have chosen to let him carry that weight himself, in a cell, for as long as the law requires, rather than pretend for his comfort that none of it happened. If this story has moved you at all, I want to ask you to comment the word "standing" below, because that is what I am doing now, still standing, and I want to know that some of you are standing too, whatever your own version of this has looked like. And once more, a gentle note that portions of the dialogue and certain identifying details in this account have been adapted for the purposes of storytelling, though the underlying pattern of elder financial exploitation, and the way it so often travels through the people we trust the most, is drawn from very real and very common cases. I want to tell you what came after, because I think the after matters just as much as the betrayal itself, maybe more. Ember and Oak closed within 2 months of the arrests, its assets seized as part of the restitution order, and I will admit that some part of me grieved the building even while I understood exactly what it had been built to hide. Margaret Doyle helped me recover what could be recovered of my accounts, though restitution, as anyone who has been through this will tell you, is a slow and often incomplete process, and I have accepted that I will likely never see the full $80,000 again. I have made peace with that in a way I did not expect to. The money was never really the thing that broke, and the money is not, in the end, the thing that needed fixing most. Ruth Callahan and I have dinner together most Sunday evenings now, an old habit that started as her checking in on a grieving widower and has become, somewhere along the way, something closer to family. Sam Okafor still fixes anything electronic I bring him and refuses, every time, to let me pay full price. Frank Delgado calls every few months just to ask how I'm holding up, which I understand now is not something every retired detective bothers to do, and I understand it as the kindness it is. I attend a small support group at the community center on Tuesday evenings, a room full of people who understand, in a way most people simply cannot, what it feels like to discover that trust and love do not automatically protect you from harm, that they can, in the wrong hands, become the exact tools used against you. Vanessa reached out to me for months after the sentencing, and we have had, since then, a slow and careful correspondence that I do not know yet what to call. She is rebuilding a life on her own terms, working as a hostess in a small diner 2 towns over, and she told me, in a letter I have read more than once, that she is in therapy trying to understand why she stayed quiet as long as she did. I do not think forgiveness is a word I owe her yet, but I think understanding might be, and I am trying to leave room for both of us to figure out which one we actually need. Gregory writes to me from the correctional facility every few weeks. I have read some of his letters. I have not answered most of them. I am not telling you this because I think it's the right choice for everyone in my position, only because it is the choice that has let me sleep at night, and I have learned that healing does not require you to reopen every door that was slammed shut behind you. Some doors can stay closed, and closing them is not cruelty. It is simply the boundary a person is allowed to keep. Here is what I want to leave you with, and I have thought about how to say this for a long time. I spent 68 years believing that love was the safest thing in the world, that the people who share your blood and your history could never truly be the ones to hurt you the worst, because why would they, when they had everything to lose by doing it? I was wrong, and I do not say that lightly. Love did not protect me. Attention protected me. A neighbor who noticed a mismatched story protected me. A tech-savvy friend who could read what a hard drive actually held protected me. An attorney who moved fast instead of gently protected me. A detective who took an old man's suspicions seriously protected me. Every one of those things required someone, including me, to stop assuming that because a thing felt like family, it was automatically safe. If someone you love suddenly needs your signature more urgently than they need your presence, ask why. If the story you're told doesn't match the story a neighbor or a friend saw with their own eyes, trust the mismatch over your own hope that everything is fine. If your instincts tell you something is wrong at a dinner table, in a phone call, in the small print of a document someone is rushing you to sign, do not talk yourself out of that feeling because the person asking is someone you raised, someone you married, someone whose face you have loved since before they could speak. Predators do not always look like strangers. Sometimes they look like your son's business partner pouring you a cup of coffee and calling you by a dead man's name out of habit. I am not the same man I was the night that photograph of a ribbon cutting landed on my phone. I am more careful now, and more tired in a way that has nothing to do with age, and I am, more than either of those things, still here, still standing, still capable of trusting people again, carefully, slowly, on my own terms rather than out of obligation to a name on a birth certificate. That, to me, is the real victory in all of this, not the sentencing, not the recovered funds, but the fact that I did not let what happened turn me into a man who can no longer let anyone in at all. Thank you for sitting with this story from beginning to end. If it moved you, if any piece of it reminded you of your own family, your own quiet suspicions, your own moment of noticing something didn't add up, I would be grateful to hear about it in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from, tell me what stood out to you most, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing, because these stories exist to help all of us recognize the warning signs a little sooner than I did. One last gentle reminder before I let you go: certain names, dialogue, and details throughout this account have been adapted and dramatized for the purposes of storytelling, though the pattern of financial exploitation it describes reflects real and documented harm that happens to families every single day. Take care of each other. Ask the hard questions. And if something in your own life feels the way that photograph felt to me, trust that feeling enough to look a little closer. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next story.